welcome everyone for another interesting session with Ben. And hey, Ben, how are you?
Hey there, great. I'm just joining now, so excited to be part of Ask Me Anything.
Okay, great, excellent. So let's start with a quick introduction. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining from. Folks, a warm welcome to every one of you for what we expect to be an incredibly valuable session. We are absolutely thrilled to have you here today. So it's going to be a special event today. It's an Ask Me Anything event focused on one of the most powerful frameworks for driving business success, OKRs. And we are absolutely privileged to be joined by a true pioneer in the field, Ben Lamont. Right? Ben, as you know, is a world-renowned OKR coach and expert who has dedicated his career to mastering the art of strategy execution. With decades of experience, he has personally guided transformative change at industry-leading organizations like eBay, Adobe, and Capital One, helping them to connect ambitious vision to measurable daily results. So today, Ben will share his practical, real-world insights on how OKRs can solve your most critical business pains. Right? Everything from strategic misalignment or unclear priorities to stalled execution and lack of visibility. So we have already got a set of excellent questions, right, from audience. This has been out in the open. We have received probably about 20 plus very good questions. And we absolutely encourage all of you who are watching to type your own questions into the chat, right? And we may be able to pick up a few, right? And this may be a great opportunity to get answers directly from a master coach, right, Ben? So without further ado, please join me in giving a huge welcome to Ben Lamont. Ben, the stage is yours. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And what I think I've tried to explain before is we've done more of a lecture and then maybe some questions at the end. But the questions have been so good that we really wanted to sit down and say, let's just jump into questions. So I don't really have much else to say other than let's jump right into questions. And then I think Senthil said it. We have a list of questions in the chat. There are a lot of questions to cover. We tried to get the list down to about 20. And if you look at those questions and you don't see a question that you really want to ask, go ahead and type it into the chat. We'll try to get to it. But let's just jump right in, I guess, is the point.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. So Ben, probably the first question is that, somebody has a situation, they have about 1,500 active users, right? Or people who need to really embrace OKRs. They've just started the OKR program, right? So their question is, what's the fastest path to scale their OKR program, right? When they are planning with about 1,500 people, right? What are the critical milestones they must hit, right, every quarter? In how many quarters should they scale up? How should the scale up happen?
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to emphasize is the idea of fastest, right? So trying to get the program to scale fastest, really we want to nail it before we scale it. So we talk about a crawl, walk, run approach. So here, what I'm saying is many organizations that I talk to, even when they do succeed with OKRs, they'll come back and say, my only regret is we went too fast. We should have slowed down. We should have got it maybe working at a smaller group of people first and then expanded, right? Because otherwise you're experimenting on the whole company. I mean, if you try to do 1,500 people all at once and just go, let's do it, that could be a potential disaster. I mean, it still might work, but you might fail at scale, which is not good. So number one milestone is your deployment parameters have to be in place. These are your answers to the questions, right? How many OKRs will we set? Will we allow for milestone key results? Why are we doing OKRs in the first place? What does the OKR template look like? Do we need to specify why the objective is important? How will we score the key results? Are we writing them as stretch? Are we writing them as commit? So all of those kind of FAQs, you need to have those nailed down. So that's kind of a foundational thing that can usually be done in a few days. So it's not a difficult thing to do, but it is a critical thing to do before you scale it across 1,500 people. The next thing you can do is training. Now with training, of course, you need a really good training program with 1,500 people. You can't just, launch OKRs now. You got to have a systematic training. And I think there's 3 types of training workshops. So one of them is, let's just jump into OKRs. Here's how it works. And let's start drafting OKRs and applying the basic principles. And that's your basic training. You definitely need that. That will be informed by your deployment parameters, right, that we talked about. And then You're going to want what I call an internal coach training. Some people call this a champion training, but I call it an internal coach. Typically, these are your agile coaches or your HR business partners. You're going to need about one coach for every 50 people. So in this case, 1,500 people. Do the math. You need about 30 internal coaches trained up in how to go on supporting the OKRs program, knowing the questions to ask to keep OKRs on track and make sure that their high quality OKRs are being created. Now, the final training is a training that I sometimes forget to do, but with this, it's called a KR champion training. And think of the KR champion as the person who puts their name next to the key result, the key result owner. Some people call them the key result owner or the key result manager. But you're the one who has your name next to that key result. What do? You need a special training for that person so that they know how to play their role. Finally, there's scaling the OKRs through the whole organization. And you want to get individual contributors involved early, but not as the key result champions, but rather as completing action items underneath a key result so that individual contributors are seeing the OKRs. There's not OKRs for every individual person, but they're doing activities that drive a key result forward. So they see how they're involved with the OKRs and they're learning about the strategy. So a lot of milestones in there. It probably is going to take 6 to 12 months realistically. 6 months kind of is what I would say a minimum 2 cycles to get the organization to adopt OKRs at that level. A year is probably a more realistic target.
Okay. That's a great response. Thank you very much, Ben. Now, this second is a very interesting question on ROI and buy-in, right? We see a lot of times situation where there is a good, I would say, champion for OKRs, and we are talking about pre-implementation or even before an organization has conclusively decided to go for OKRs, right? So they need to get the executive support, and one way they're looking is to quantify the OKR program ROI, right, in hard business terms. Right. So the question is, how do I quantify OKR program ROI in hard business terms? Right. So it could be revenue acceleration or cost savings in order to secure executive funding, right? So
yeah, this is an excellent question. I've struggled with this for a while. I just put in the chat my 2015 blog post. I mean, this is funny to say. That's 10 years ago. Okay, I think I didn't even know they had blogs back then, right? I mean, I'm definitely getting a little bit of gray hair with OKRs in my second decade with this thing. But we did an analysis of ROI at Sears, and it was what we call a natural study, I think it was called, because the people didn't know they were being studied. We ended up looking at the data and seeing what happened, and it did show some effectiveness of OKRs, and you can read about it. But it really was more of a placebo effect, if you will, of just the natural thing that happens when you set goals in general. I don't know that you can say it was specific to OKRs. In fact, when I looked at their actual OKRs that they wrote down, I was like, wow. I mean, this is one of the OKRs was smile more when people, come to the door. I was like, that's not really an OKR. But they were writing down sort of their goals, and that seemed to help them. The fact is, you cannot measure the ROI of OKRs. You cannot attribute a growth in revenue to the fact that you're doing OKRs, or, we got all these customers, because we're doing OKRs. If we weren't doing OKRs, we wouldn't have got those customers. It's kind of a nonsense. Your heart's in the right place. I want to see that ROI. What I'm trying to say is you can't measure it. So the bottom line is, as frustrating as it is to say this, I'm going to say, do not attempt to measure the ROI of OKRs, but rather look for anecdotal value, right? Oh, I feel this is helping me. Like, it's more of a qualitative thing.
Great, thanks. Now, we are now moving to the actual planning phase of the OKR program. Everybody has heard about stretch goals. So now there's a question about how do you calibrate stretch goals? Right. So the actual question is, what's the ideal percentage of stretch OKRs for a high-performing team? And how do you enforce quality control to prevent sandbagging?
Right. And I think this is another part of the deployment plan, right? We talk about the deployment parameters in the very beginning, which will also reflect your company culture. So for example, I always recommend to level set is to write every key result as a stretch target commit, because otherwise some people write key results. Like, some teams might have really, really aggressive key results that they're never going to hit. Other teams might be sandbagging, and you don't really know, because until you kind of go through OKRs for a while, then you have to audit it and say, oh wait, this team is achieving all their key results. But then again, they're just making an action list of things they know they're going to get done anyway. So that's not really any good. whereas this other team is setting really high goals and they're not achieving it. So coming up with a standard model like stretch, target, commit, where every key result is written as, let's say, a target level, like a 50-50 shot, and then you have a parenthetical, by the way, here's what the stretch looks like, here's what the commit looks like. Now, what I'll tell you is some startups write every key result as a stretch, and then they say, oh, by the way, here's a commit level, sort of a parenthetical, oh, by the way. I've worked with government organizations, get this, where they write every key result as a commit, and then they say, oh, wow, this would be a target level, but they don't even want to use the word stretch. So having this discussion with the team from the start and putting it into your FAQs document is key so that we are aligned on the level of stretch with our OKRs. Now, the one thing I will say is that it's a basic principle of OKRs that you should set stretch goals. That said, like I said, in the government, they're using OKRs and they're not setting stretch goals, and that's what works for them. So, you know, you really have to think about what works for your organization and what level of stretch you are. And I really want to invite you to use these deployment parameters as a way of reflecting your culture. Okay, that's the point.
Yeah, that's pretty helpful. And staying on the topic of stretch goals, there's a question on how do you validate stretch goals, right? How do I know if a stretch goal is really a stretch? How do I, this is particularly relevant, when you are evaluating stretch goals across departments, right? So there could be different managers with different standards. As an organization, how do you enforce, right? There is a quality of the stretch. How do you measure the stretch quality across departments? That's a question.
I mean, the first thing I would say is stretch goals should generally be created by the team members rather than top down. If you've ever worked in an organization where the leadership team says, here are the goals, they're stretch, good luck. You don't have that buy-in, and it may in fact be a stretch, but then again, it may not, because a lot of times the leaders are just coming up with numbers because, the board member said this or some, they have some idea. So leadership should then have the team propose what a stretch goal looks like. And we should understand a stretch goal is a goal that is 10% likely to be met or 20% likely to be met. You have to, again, define what that percentage is, right? So some people say stretch goals are like these moonshots, which we're throwing out there, and absolutely none of them will be achieved. And even if you get halfway there, that's going to be amazing, right? Okay, so that's fine too, but you have to write that down in a line on what we're even talking about when we say stretch goal. And then the other thing is, at the end of the period, you can kind of do an audit. And you can see, well, let's look at our key results and let's figure out what percentage of our key results are hitting the stretch. Now, I've seen cases where usually what happens is when you're first starting with OKRs, either you hit 0 of the stretch key results or you hit like almost all of them, because that's an indicator that that team might be sandbagging if they're going to hit almost all of them, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're hitting 90% of your stretch goals, it's very unlikely that in fact you've done amazing things and achieved all these, but it's still possible. So I don't want it to be some algorithm that just sort of flags you and says, you're bad because you sandbag. The one thing that I will say to do this is a reflect and reset at the end. Everybody who has their name next to that key result where the stretch key result is achieved has to do a story. They have to explain, how in the world did this happen? We didn't expect it would happen. Somehow there was a surprising event. Somebody did an extra thing. There's something in the marketplace that changed. We took a different approach. What is that story that allowed us to achieve that stretch key result? And by the way, I had one client recently. I don't remember the exact nature of it. It was something like get a certain number of users on this new product. And I think their goal was 1,000. They hit 17,000 new users like in the core. I mean, there was a complete destruction of their key result. They just completely blew it away. And I said, okay, well, let's talk about how that happened. And we learned, and what we were able to do is capture some of those learnings and then apply that into the next product launch. So don't just be all concerned about, oh, did we achieve the stretch and are we sandbagging, but really have that inquisitive nature of, wow, okay, how can we learn from that and apply that to other areas of our business? That's really what's going to be important with this stretch key result mindset.
Okay. That's pretty helpful. Thank you, Ben. Now, Ben, there's a question on planning efficiency, right? And I see this with a lot of customers where, they know that, in Q1, right, when they first implement OKRs, there's a lot of learning. So there's a pretty significant amount of time that people need to really spend to do the planning and just get the exercise, off the board, right? Now, the question is, how much time should we spend planning for Q1, right, when they're first starting the OKR program, compared with later, right? In the later quarters, right, should we see significant savings in time, right, in the planning process? So that's the question which people want to know.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to emphasize that the first time you do it, you're probably going to take a little bit longer. Absolutely. But it's not, you're never going to be, it's not the goal to, get the planning cycle down to, 2 days or something. There's a certain amount of time that we need to have an effective planning cycle. That's probably 1 or 2 weeks before the cycle ends is when you sort of start planning and, thinking about reflect and reset and drafting OKRs, closing out your cycle. And then 1 or 2 weeks into that next period. So what I really just said was 2 to 4 weeks, right? So you're looking at a 2 to 4 week end of the day planning cycle. And probably you're starting at around 4 weeks and you're trying to get to about 2 weeks. But you don't really want to go much past that. I mean, it's not like I said, if you get it, oh, well, our planning is all done in 1 week and we close everything out. We're not just trying to get it over with. One thing I will tell you is many organizations have moved to a 4-month cycle. So baked into this question is how much time should we spend planning Q1, right? So I'm thinking quarterly. And even though quarterly tends to be the default mindset, I really want people to step back and say, wait a minute, do we really need 4 cycles in a year? More and more organizations are moving toward having just 3 cycles in a year because they don't really see the incremental value of going from 3 planning cycles to 4 planning cycles in a year. And in fact, if it takes you 2 weeks to do the planning, you're spending a lot of your time planning, and it's good to plan, but is it really too much overhead now if we're going into 4 planning cycles in a year? The other challenge is if Q1 is January 1st, well, you're in trouble, right? Because the last 2 weeks of the quarter probably are the year end and no one was even in the office. The first 2 weeks, it's the beginning of the year and many people are just getting back. They've got a lot of things going on. So be sensitive to the timing because calendar weeks, if you're doing, January 1st, you might be looking at 6 weeks because you might have 3 weeks in there that's a buffer where there's nobody there anyway. So you start to scratch your head and people start to feel inefficient because if it's February and you're announcing OKRs for Q1, January, February, March, let's say is your Q1, and now it's February 10th and people are saying, here are the OKRs, you're always going to have that wise guy in the back that says, did you know that this quarter is already halfway over and now you're telling me these are the OKRs? Like, isn't that bad? And it kind of is. So you got to be intentional about how you plan with your efficiency. And there's a few moving parts here, but one of the levers is how many cycles you have in the calendar year. And then the other one is, here's another trick that people do is start this first cycle on February 1st instead of January 1st so that you avoid this guy in the back of the room saying, hey, we're already halfway through.
And of course, if you have a tool like Profit.co, the process of reflect reset is going to make your further quarter plannings, much efficient, right? That goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. There is something to be said for when you're first doing OKRs. There's also learning involved with how do OKRs even work, right? So you're going to have some challenges there. But I do think that it's not like once I do my first cycle and now I'm at steady state, but the fact is now I'll have some kind of set of OKRs experience that I can use as a starting point, and then I can modify those and sort of have maybe my objectives more or less stay the same. So, you'll see that there's I'd say there's some advantages. Probably it's about a 2x from that first cycle, which could be like 4 weeks, to ideally that second cycle will be closer to 2 weeks, right? I mean, this is ideal.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. That was pretty insightful. Now, there's a very interesting question on cross-functional execution during planning, right? So the question is, how do I address cross-functional dependencies during OKR planning?
Yeah. So this is a big one. And in fact, if you've read the OKRs field book, I have the 5 mantras for OKRs coaching. I won't state them all here. But I will say that there's a 6th mantra, okay, which I haven't put in the book, and that's called embed alignment into every aspect of an OKRs program. And so what does that mean? Well, for example, for cross-functional execution, this is so important because I would say probably the number one, there's 2 problems actually. There's 2 problems that I see my clients having the most often, other than we have too many OKRs. Okay, that's maybe the number one most common. But throw that one out because that one's already been talked about a lot. The number one most common is to see OKRs that just look like a to-do list. We're just checking things off. They're not even outcomes. So they're not even key results. They're just action items. Okay, so we see that a lot as well. But when you're more mature, even when you're more mature with OKRs, you're going to run into this cross-functional execution problem. What I would say is you're going to run into this cross-functional execution problem whether or not you're doing OKRs. It's just a challenge that you're going to have in any company. There's no silver bullet here. However, there's things we can do when we do OKRs that really make OKRs ineffective because we work in silos. In fact, I've seen OKRs used to enhance silo effects because every team is working on OKRs completely in isolation. Or we can use OKRs to improve cross-functional execution. Breaking news, how about we use OKRs to improve cross-functional execution? And in order to do this, think of it, embed alignment into every aspect of the OKRs program. What do I mean by that? Well, when you do your training workshops, bring in members from those dependent teams that are working closely together to do the training together. I know it sounds silly, but I've done workshops before where the big takeaway at the end was, wow, it was so great. You know, I'm in the sales team and marketing and customer success. I mean, I know they're out there, but I spent the whole day, you know, or half day, you know, developing OKRs and talking about things. And I came away with all these insights. Okay, that is a really cool thing that you can do. That's simple by bringing in multiple people, you know, into the training workshop from multiple cross-functional teams where we know that those teams are going to be working closely together. Similarly, look at the next thing, right? That was the training. But what about when we're drafting OKRs? Hey, draft OKRs, bring in the multiple dependent teams, have team members rotate into other groups. Another thing that I've seen work is when we publish the key results, instead of having a key result with one name, and this is like the sales key result, or that's the marketing key result, or whatever, put in two names. Or in one of my clients, we had a problem. We had a disconnect between the business group and the tech group. Make every key result have one name from business and one name from tech. Force the conversations across business and tech. In that example, happened to work for them really well because now business and tech were on the same page. They were able to align, you know, on the message that they were giving to leadership, and you know, make sure that resources were going toward those key results properly. So little things like that can work. The final thing that I'll give you as a clue is sometimes people just copy and paste the org chart and say that's the structure for OKRs. Might work, but what we find more often than not is actually merging some teams together. So I keep on saying like sales and marketing, or, you know, customer success and customer support. A lot of people might even wonder what's the difference between those two departments anyway. Well, how about merge departments that work really closely together and have them create a single set of OKRs together? This allows you to create an OKR team, which is cross-functional inherently. And it forces the cross-functional work to get done jointly, as opposed to, you know, these are our reporting structures. So lots of ideas for how to improve cross-functional execution. And I think the deeper question is, how do I embed alignment into OKRs? And I want you to think about this actually like as a question, even when you write your FAQs. Okay, so if you have somebody writing the OKR FAQs, don't just have somebody from finance do that, or somebody from HR do that. Have it be that we pick 2 or 3 people from different areas. And we, you know, when we give OKR examples, we don't just give HR examples of the OKRs, you know, rather we give examples from multiple groups. This is what I mean by embedding alignment into the entire OKRs program.
Very practical choices and advices. Thank you very much, Ben, for that. Now, so we are done with planning and we're now in execution. So there's a question on how do you conduct the review meetings for OKRs, right? So the question is, what are the best practices for OKR review meetings? How often should we run them? And what should be the agenda for the OKR review meetings?
Yeah, okay, so first of all, I should emphasize there's 2 types of OKR review meetings, right? You have your team check-in, which is just, you know, your team. Like I said, it might be sales and marketing if they're forming the team for OKRs, but it's typically a team, relatively small group of people, maybe 10 people, maybe 12 people, maybe 5 people. And they're going to meet typically anyway. They might meet weekly. Okay, if you meet weekly, then you would probably do a review of each key result in that meeting. You'd probably cover all the key results. Hopefully you don't have 25 key results, right? A team should have maybe, you know, 8 to 12 key results is kind of a sweet spot. And you're going to do a minute or 2 on each key result. Maybe there's one that needs a little bit more time, sure. So that's if you're doing a weekly cadence on review. Now, more and more organizations are moving to bi-weekly, which means that if they're an agile team or what have you, right, they might be meeting every 2 weeks. And so now they might have a bi-weekly review of their key results. Or they meet weekly, but every other meeting, they go through all their key results. And then the meeting when they're not doing the key results, maybe they just talk about ad hoc. We have to talk about this key result or that key result, but we don't go through and read out every key result. That's important because if you're not careful, you're going to have this meeting fatigue, right? Where we're just reading through all the key results, and it's like, well, we just talked about this last week. There's no change. You're sort of BSing your way through it, and people are trying to look good. So you have to avoid that, which is why I think more and more teams are moving to a bi-weekly update. When you do the update at the team level, you're going to go through and give the 4 boxes, right? The current value, the predicted score or confidence level, the blockers and risks. You've seen this before, probably in the next steps. However, for the multi-team check-in, this is where you're bringing in lots of teams together to give an update, probably to leadership. You only want to have one such meeting in the middle of the cycle. You don't need to do this, more than once in the middle of the cycle. And what happens here is each team generally, you don't have time. If you have 8 teams, updating progress on their key results in one meeting, you can't read through every key result. I mean, it'll be like 4 hours. So you've got to give highlights. And the way to do it is to pick 2 key results for each team. Here's the big win. In other words, have that team think about what is the key result that we're most proud of, that we really are moving the needle, we're winning. Let's celebrate that and let's share that with the team. And usually you thank the other people who have helped. If there's any cross-functional dependencies, you say, great job, IT really came through for us. We're nailing this key result. It's huge progress. But then you also invite them to show a key result. We call it the big learn. And this is where, things aren't going so well here, but this is what we learned. Like, oh yeah, in some cases, it's like, yeah, we are getting more mobile app downloads. We're on track to achieve the key result. That's the good news. The bad news is, so what, right? These mobile app downloads are going to mean nothing, and we're spending money. We're actually buying mobile app downloads, and we're going to achieve this key result, and it's going to be a net negative. In fact, we might want to throw this key result out entirely. So that's where you're becoming a little bit more vulnerable. You're saying, look, maybe we screwed up. This is, or it's somehow driving the wrong behavior or what have you. Or there's no way we're going to achieve this key result. We set it out, and you know what? It's impossible. And every time we look at it, we just feel like, it just is a reminder of how much of a failure we are. So we're going to we either need to rewrite it, or we're running into some problems here. So you're showing the vulnerabilities. It makes the meeting more engaging, and it also makes it more actionable. So leadership isn't just going to sit here and say, wow, everybody's doing great, it's all in the green. But also leadership isn't going to sit here and just have it, everything's a panic, everything's bad, it's all red, like let's only talk about that, because then you don't get the feeling of winning at work. So those are the 2 types of review meetings that you have, and hopefully that gives you an outline for how to make those work.
Yeah, absolutely. That's quite insightful. Thank you very much, Ben. Now, here's a question on program maturity, and probably this is coming from folks who are responsible for large programs. The question is, how do we judge the OKR program maturity, right? Beyond adoption rates, what could be maybe the top 5 indicators to prove that an OKR program has reached maturity, and how do we benchmark ours?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Well, first of all, I think in the question you pointed out that it should not just simply be adoption, because it's not necessarily the case that if everybody adopts OKRs, the program is a success, because OKRs is not really a compliance system, where we're just trying to get, people to adopt the system. What if they adopt the system and it's bad? Right? Well, that's not good. So every team should set OKRs in general. I should say not every team should set OKRs in general, because you might have a team like the call center or what have you, and they're just doing business as usual stuff. They already have metrics to say, let's write our OKRs. In fact, they might not even need to know what the company strategy is. They might just be doing their business stuff. Okay. So you have to be careful about coming up with adoption rate as the metric. And in fact, the more OKRs you write, like if you were to say, well, let's have, how many OKRs do we have? That's the metric. No, because actually less is more is my first mantra. Like actually a smaller set of OKRs tends to be more of an indicator of maturity. So let's see the 5 things. So number 1 would be, are the objectives clearly connected to some kind of a strategy, right? Every company should have some kind of a strategy, a North Star, a mission statement, something like that. And the objective, by definition, should be somehow connected to a higher level strategy or a pillar or whatever you want to call it. In other words, OKRs themselves should not just be your strategy. There should be some kind of a separate strategy. And the second one would be, do the objectives have a clearly stated why and why now? In other words, a lot of organizations that are, let's say, not very mature with OKRs will simply write the objective, key results. Our objective is to move to the cloud. Our key results are 25% goes to 60% of users are in the cloud or whatever. But meanwhile, I don't even know, wait, why are we moving to the cloud? Is it just because everybody else is doing it? I mean, what is this move to the cloud thing? You didn't tell me why that's important. And is it really important now? Is now the time? So by taking time to bullet point out, here's why it's important, and here's why it's important now, you're communicating, you're educating the team, and you're also motivating the team and creating urgency. So if you have the why and why now, and good news, I know at Profit.co, I've seen the demo, we have the ability to put in the why and why now into the objective, which is an essential step if you want to be effective with OKR. And then, is there some kind of an OKRs FAQs document that, let's say I'm a new person in the organization and I'm wondering, the basic things like, wait, why are we doing OKRs? It answers all those questions about those deployment parameters, right? Like, how long is the OKR cycle? How many OKRs are we going to have? An example would be, it has an explanation, right? It doesn't just say, here are the answers, but here's the explanation. So remember I said earlier, OKRs can be used to inform your culture or reflect your culture. So you might have a thing that says, hey, the reason we're doing OKRs is to help us focus. Great, that's a common one. So that's why our deployment parameter is every team gets one objective, maximum 4 key results. In other words, this is going to be how OKRs is going to be what we use to say, what's the most important objective for us now, and how are we going to measure it? It's not, of course, there's other work we need to do, but this is the focus. Radical focus is what we might call it. So that would be one example of how you would use that OKRs FAQs document to really reflect your culture. So it's not only do I have one, but the explanations make sense and are reflective of my culture. The other one is, are most of my key results, if not all of my key results, outcome-based, right? In other words, when you're first going with OKRs, you often have key results that look like update the blog, post the website, hire the new director, right? Like, these are things we need to get done. But if they're more mature, they're going to look like increase the number of, demo signups from 10 to 20 per month based on the blog or whatever. So it's not just how many blog posts did I write. We're not measuring how much work did I do, but rather what is the outcome of the work that we're doing. And that's going to be the fourth one. Gosh, I need a fifth one. Okay. Probably the fifth one is some kind of a way of having a pulse check on how effective the OKRs program is. So getting sort of a way of getting feedback from the team. And there's 2 groups you want feedback from: leadership and, quote, the rest of the company. So leadership should give you some kind of feedback around, yes, because we're doing OKRs, our company is more on track. We're more focused. I have better visibility into how we're doing. I sleep better at night, or something like that, right? That would be the kind of thing leadership will say. And the managers and the individual contributors are going to feel like, okay, OKRs is actually something that's, giving me better visibility into company strategy. I feel like I can better connect my work. I know how to prioritize, whatever those things are. And you want to kind of hold yourself accountable for, you can't just say, oh, look, we're doing OKRs. We're really mature because, Ben said we have an FAQs document and look, here it is. But rather, let's also have that fifth one that I just described, which is like, let's make sure, let's validate with our leadership and then our company that in fact OKRs is a positive experience. It's adding value. Because I've seen in many cases, especially with big companies, leadership loves OKRs. They're like, wow, this is great. It's totally transformational. And then they'll pay me to go implement OKRs with like lots and lots of teams. And maybe half of the teams find OKRs to be, really useful. But the other half, maybe half of that half, right? So 25% is like, yeah, OKRs, whatever. It's just something we need to do. It's like a compliance thing. But there might be another group that says this is destructive. Like, this is a total waste of time. It's hindering. It's hurting my ability to get my job done because it's something that my boss wants to do. I just want to leave me alone so I can get my work done. That's a problem, right? Because now you might think you're in a mature OKR situation, but actually you might be doing some damage. So that's why we're actually, we haven't announced it yet, but sometime in the next couple months, we're going to have an assessment for large companies who are kind of struggling with that issue of, yeah, we think it's going great, but oh my gosh, these other people don't. How do we identify those teams and how do we make it work for those teams? That's a really important question now, because more and more organizations, especially big companies, are using OKRs at scale. And of course, like anything, if you're doing it at scale, it's probably working here and maybe not working there. It's not just black and white, like, oh, it's great.
Sure. That's super helpful. Thank you very much. We are entering the last 10 minutes of this session, and I'm going to jump a question or two. So here's a very interesting question on performance intervention, right? When people aren't performing well on OKRs, what's the best way to stage an intervention? Yeah.
Yeah, well, so going back to Sears, where they actually set individual person level OKRs, they had a pretty much a 3 strikes and you're out policy. So if you didn't hit your key results the first time, that was kind of expected. And if you didn't hit the second time, it was like, hey, what's going on? Are you setting your key results too high, or what's happening? If you didn't hit your key results the third time, it was kind of like, okay, we got to start talking about, performance evaluation stuff. But that said, that was Sears, which is no longer in business anyway. But that was 10 years ago. Generally, OKRs is really not used as a performance system, but rather we're looking at evaluating people with OKRs on how well, if you put your name next to a key result, right? I'm not going to evaluate you on did the key result get achieved or not, and say, you're a good employee or a bad employee because it didn't get achieved. Of course, if we do that, everybody's going to go toward the game system model. I'm not going to put my name on the key result unless I'm damn sure we're going to hit that thing, because I don't want to be, told that I'm not good. So we actually have a better way of managing the performance of those, what I call key result champions, which is how well do they construct a team? Did they have a good cadence with that team? Did they clearly communicate what needs to get done? Were the individual contributors on that team able to execute on their tasks? And if not, how did that key result champion escalate blockers or risks to leadership? Or was there a surprise at the end of the cycle where they said, well, we thought it was all going to go, but it didn't go? This is not what leadership wants. Leadership wants proactive managers on that key result to escalate as needed and to stay on top of it. So you can kind of sense if somebody's doing that or not. And then at the end of the cycle, key result champions get evaluated. Now, I will give you another idea here, which is even if you only have OKRs, let's say at the company and team level, right? Individual contributors who might be, not having their own OKRs, they put their name next to a key result, usually by invitation. In other words, leadership says, hey, we think you would be a great key result champion. Why don't you put your name on this key result? That's an honor. And if you do a good job, that's exposure to leadership. And there's an upside because you might get more, let's say, recognition from leadership. So it might be an informal, it's not like it's going to go into your actual performance review and whatever, but it might be more of an informal thing. So I almost want to think of it more as an opportunity for success rather than we need to come out and get you. If you start doing OKRs as sort of a, hey, you're putting your name on the key results, like, let's find out, we need to stage an intervention here. This guy's not performing. You're probably going to end up with a bad OKR program. This happened at Yahoo, where they were developing Marissa. Yahoo at the time was their CEO, and she used OKRs. In the first cycle, it was great because she actually used OKRs to identify poor performers, and it worked really well. The problem is the second cycle, now the whole OKRs thing is a fear culture. And so it starts to be like, oh, nobody wants to have that person working with them because they know that they're not a good performer. So I'm only going to work with, Mary because Mary gets shit done, or whatever. So it started creating these weird politics in the office. So I want to be really careful about this question. Generally, we're not using OKRs to stage interventions with our employees.
Okay, that's incredibly insightful. Thanks for giving those examples. Now, here's a question on training new joiners on OKRs, right? So question is, what's the most effective way to train new joiners or teams new to OKRs, to the philosophy?
Yeah. So one of my mantras is the only way to learn OKRs is to do OKRs. So the best advice I can give you is just jump in and just learn by doing. That said, at Google and in many organizations, they don't, when you're a new employee, you don't just set OKRs, or, if you're a manager, hey, write OKRs. You don't do that in your first quarter or so of working there. You're more in observation mode, and you look at the OKRs. And actually, this is a great way to get onboarded into a new company. In fact, if you've worked in a company that used OKRs effectively, and you go to another company that doesn't use OKRs, you're going to scratch your head and say, well, wait, do we even know what we're doing? It's like the OKRs become sort of the way of knowing what's important. We're going to go to that. That's how we know. And this is the objective. Okay, here are the key results. So usually you give them one cycle to observe. And I would say, there might be a video training. I've done those for my clients. I don't know how effective the video trainings are. I do find that, well, for me, when I'm offering coaching, if you're a new joiner and you're a pretty high level person, I like to do a one-on-one as an external coach. I'll do that with some of my clients where I just I ramp them up individually, maybe in half an hour, 45 minutes onto here's the context, here's why, this is your OKR for your team, whatever. They really like that. So because people are usually joining, in random periods. If you're in a company where, we're hiring 100 people in this quarter and we can onboard them all, maybe then you can have an official training. And I've worked with organizations like that as well. But typically, this person's coming in, that person's coming in. You're going to want to do a small onboarding one-on-one on how OKRs work and what is your expectation for your OKRs, and like, let me show you some of the OKRs. So that can be part of your onboarding, is to actually show them the OKRs and let them know that they'll be more involved later. But for now, just like learn about the company and challenge these OKRs and so forth.
Okay, great. Maybe we have time for a couple of more questions. So here's a question on OKR retrospectives. So probably somebody familiar with Sprint. Sprints, what's your advice for running effective OKR retrospectives?
Yeah. So first of all, a good OKR retrospective is not really a retrospective that looks back only, but rather we look back and we look forward. I call it a reflect and reset, so that the end of the meeting is, here are the draft OKRs for the next cycle. Because otherwise what happens is you do the retrospective, there tends to be a lot of, oh, well, we didn't achieve this, that was because IT did that. It kind of can get a little bit negative or defensive. And then the meeting kind of ends. And then we say, don't forget, next week we got to get together and start drafting our OKRs. And people are like, oh, great. You can just see the body language. So it's a subtle point. But if you do the reflect and reset, you actually look back at, you go zigzag. So you go key result by key result. So you take the key result, you say, and it's very matter of fact, did we achieve it? Yes or no? What? Okay, great. We don't judge you. We just, okay, that's fine. What did we learn? Okay. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't work, whatever it is, fine. And do we keep, modify, or remove that key result? And if we're going to, remove it, why? Is it achieved? Is it a bad key result? Whatever. Or if we're going to keep it, which means basically copy and paste that key result, maybe change the numbers a little bit, but the structure of the key result is fine. Okay, that's fine. Now we actually have a placeholder key result for next cycle. So at the end of the meeting, we're going to walk out and say, okay, hey, guys, we completed our reflect and reset. Here's the initial set of key results. Do we want to keep our key result champions on here? Okay, great. You guys are in charge of that. This objective is basically the same. We think we need a key result here to modify. Who's going to do that? Okay, great. Let's meet together next week and we'll go ahead and refine these, and we'll publish them within the next week or two. And now it's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I like OKRs. This is working. We have momentum. We're clearly moving the progress forward. So that's my main advice for the OKR reflect and reset. The final thing, though, that I'll say is sometimes, again, cross-functional. Bring in two dependent teams and have them do a joint reflect and reset. So one of the teams is watching the other team do their reflect and reset. Yeah, how did we do? What did we learn? They might even say, wait, I thought we achieved this, or no, also when we were working on that, I learned that. So there's going to be a little bit of cross-functional pollination in that reflect and reset. And it's interesting, I found that the teams are a little bit more on their game when they're like, oh, that other team is coming, so we better have our act together. It's kind of like a little bit of a cultural thing if you involve that other team.
Great. There's another question on executive sponsorship. So the question is, how do I get skeptical executives to actively sponsor and not just passively approve OKRs?
Yeah, let me tell you a story. I had a mentor who was a published author, written many books in business intelligence. His name was Wayne Eckerson. And I really respected him. He's a big KPI guy. And I said, Wayne, I really want to talk to you about OKRs. And he was like, oh yeah, sounds great. Talk to Martha or whatever. And it took me like a year before I finally got on his calendar. And I said, can I just get 30 minutes? Okay. And he said, okay, fine. I was coaching him on OKRs. I said, Wayne, for your company, what is your objective? Why is that important? Okay, well, how would you measure success? Not what are you going to do, but what will be the intended outcome of that task? If you launch that new part of your website, how will we know it's a success? Let me put it this way. I was on the phone with him for 2 hours. At some point, I finally had to say, Wayne, I got to go, And he said, Ben, I guess I'm sorry I took so long to have this meeting with you. I forgot that every now and then, it's really valuable to take a step back and have somebody ask you these types of questions. This is the key point. That Wayne Eckerson story is exactly what you need to do with that sponsor. I'm pretty good at it. So, you could have me talk to that sponsor and I'll just do OKRs coaching with them. And by the end of it, they're going to be like, oh my God, we need to do this. They need to experience it. So don't try to sell them on the idea. Don't try to say, hey, look, OKRs, it was done by Intel and, everybody's doing it and it's really cool and it helps you focus. And hey, read this book. The sponsor's going to be like, bro, I don't want to do you. You're starting to sound like, spam. But if you go right in there and you start coaching them and actually asking them these questions, I would say it's about a 90% success rate. I mean, I'm not kidding you. These people it's almost like bizarre how flipped they'll get. They'll become like super saying how, this is so great. And I'm like, no, I have to like rein them down. It's not like this. It's not going to transform our company in 1 week, but it is valuable. So I really want to invite you to kind of flip the script. And, even though you're not necessarily the executive sponsor, go to them and say, what is our most important objective right now? Like, just start saying that. Why is that important? How will we know we've been successful? By the end of this time period, is 6 months a long enough cycle, or do we want to take that down to 3 months? What would be the right period for you to think about for a rapid progress here? These are the questions they want somebody to ask them. And if you ask them those questions, you're doing OKRs. So when they say, wow, this is really helpful, they say, yeah, that's OKRs. They'll usually say, oh, let's do that everywhere. This is what we need to do.
Good. Thanks, Ben. That was fun. And we have barely reached the halfway point in terms of the number of questions. And probably we need to do another session, right? I'll let you have the last word. Any closing comments before we close the session?
Yeah, I do have a closing comment. And this is a bit of a challenge to anyone on the audience who is either shopping for profit software or thinking about doing OKRs and hasn't totally gone down that path with either a coach or a software solution. I'm partnered up with Profit now. As you can see, I've been doing a lot of webinars with these guys. And we're experimenting with what we call the Quick Start OKRs program. And it's a combination of OKRs.com and Profit. And so you're going to get to take a small user base, basically a pilot group, crawl, walk, run model. And then we're going to get you using Profit as you're doing your deployment parameters and doing all these OKRs.com like approaches that I'm talking about. And, following the best practices, if you will, and using Profit as you go along the way from the start. And then the idea is that this could be done in a month. Right? This is not going to be a 1-year product. This is going to be a small group, big win, relatively low cost, quick time to value. That's what we call it, the quick start. We think that this should become a no-brainer for anyone looking to get going with an OKRs tool on a fast track. And that's why we're offering it in a sort of a pilot fashion. And we're trying to offer that, not formally, but we're sort of offering that to our quote friends. So if you made it through this Ask Me Anything and you're still listening, we think of you as a friend. So follow up, you can just contact Centil directly and we can have a meeting with you and sort of scope out and explore this possibility. But other than that, I will say, yeah, keep going. And remember to ask those OKRs questions. And I challenge anyone that goes to their executive sponsor or CEO or whoever and starts doing this OKRs coaching, I challenge you to do that and see if you can flip them into becoming the main sponsor for the program. And if you're too shy to do that, I'm happy to do a free meeting with your leader and just say, tell them, you're going to get a free OKRs coaching session with this guy, Ben, who writes OKRs books. And, if they won't even do that, then probably they're not even open to the idea. Then some people are. I mean, to be fair, some people, like even with Wayne, it took me like a year, to get on his calendar. So sometimes getting that meeting, it sounds easy, right? If I can get to that executive sponsor, yeah, it should be easy to flip them over. But the problem is getting that meeting. It may not even happen. So I realize I'm asking a lot. But if you have the ability to go talk to them, do it. Or even just talk to me without your executive sponsor, and I can coach you on how to coach them, right? On what are the questions asked. We only need about 15 to 20 minutes to do that. You'll get the idea. It's pretty simple stuff.
Thank you very much.
Those are just for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. That was absolute fun and, loaded with a lot of practical advice. And I hope people found it as useful as I found it. Right. So thank you again. And folks, we're going to be doing more such sessions, right? And we're going to be doing other webinars with Ben and our customers as well. So thank you very much for joining today. Thank you.
Yeah, the final thing is for our next one, it should probably be called Ask Me Anything Else. Right, rather than we'll have another set of 10 questions or so. We were ambitious when we tried to get through 20 in one session. So
yeah, we have at least 20 more.
Great session. Love these questions. Always have the best questions.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you folks for joining. Bye-bye.